Later this afternoon, I'm going to videotape a conversation between two CRC pastors and a CRC member who is also a lawyer, and we're going to talk about some overtures that are coming to this year's Synod. And I was going to do a little front porch video to that video, but I decided to do a much fuller video because of some events that are coming, and I wanted to give a little bit more background on this question. Should your pastor tell you how to vote? Or should your church tell you how to vote? Or should your denomination tell you how to vote? What's the relationship between politics and religion? Now, I'm not going to sort that all out for you in just however long this video takes, but this came across my desk. Someone sent this to me on Twitter yesterday. California progressives launch another attack on free speech. Now, I live in Sacramento, and there are members of my church who work in and for the legislature. And so part of what I know about California politics is that a lot of bills come through. Some of them get attention, some of them don't. This is how politics works. And now the National Review, David French in the National Review, is upset about this bill, and he's taking the angle of free speech, that this bill is another attack on free speech. This morning, another CRC pastor sent me an article, and this one from a Roman Catholic website, that talks about Assembly Bill 2943 as a direct assault on free speech and the truth about same-sex attraction. And this is written by Robert Gagnon, who has written quite a bit on same-sex attraction and gay marriage and a number of these issues. And so he's coming at it more from this way. And living in Sacramento with so many bills go through, these things come up, and I always have to try and figure out, well, what am I going to do with this? Now, it's important to remember that how politics works in terms of here in the United States and in many representative democracies. Legislation is proposed, legislation is debated, legislation is voted upon, legislation is enacted, but then often legislation is tested in courts. So a bill can pass and the courts can strike it down if they feel it violates civil liberties. That's in the United States. That's how same-sex marriage became a matter of federal law, because the Supreme Court acted on it. So people get upset about bills that are coming up in the state legislature, and they sound the alarm. Now, that's in and of itself not a bad thing, because this is part of the process. We should discuss this. And all of this is important because interested parties speak up instead of doing violence to each other. And how increasingly we get attention in our social media context is by expressing outrage. Because if someone is, the more emotionally alarmed someone is, the more attention they get. And as I mentioned in the video that I did yesterday, part of the way democracies work is that it works on hearts and minds. Now, there's a lot of motivations involved in debating a bill like this. And for those of you who are on my channel because of the Jordan Peterson conversation, Peterson notes that we see tools. And what that means is we see other people as tools. And then we see groups of other people as tools. And so we pitch our political speech in a way that ideally gets to motivate others to see things our way. Now, when I was eating breakfast this morning, I've been trying to catch up on this latest season of The Walking Dead. And there was a ferocious argument between Negan and one of his lieutenants. And Negan has this way of managing the saviors, and his lieutenant wants to kill all of the uprising of the farms and the places that were resourcing. Negan sees people as resources. In a sense, Negan sees people as tools. And one of the things I often mention in my sermons is that we often have a choice. Do we use people or do we love people? Now part of we almost all, it's very hard for us not to use people, but we ought to be cognizant of how we're using people, why we're using people. We should use things and not people. But here's the thing. What if the thing is full of people? And that thing could be a political faction, it could be an institution, it could be a number of things. And so if we see a bill like this often the idea is, well, I want to raise the visibility of this bill, and I want to get this in my pastor's hands, or I want to get this in Jordan Peterson's hands, or I want to get in front of my state representative, or I want to get in front of the governor, or I want to get in front of the president. And so we see all of these people as tools and institutions as tools, and we see opportunities and obstacles. And so we use people and institutions. And in a representative democracy, the game is winning hearts and minds, and via that, votes. And as I mentioned again in the video that I did yesterday, I'll put the link to it in the notes, that this is an improvement over killing. Because if I demand that my vision is the monarchical vision for the entire world, I will want to eliminate all competitive visions. And people are very resistant to having their wills undermined or subjugated. And so this leads to tyranny, where we kill people because that's the easiest way to shut people up permanently. And the benefit about representative democracy is hopefully we can talk and not kill. And this is why we enshrine, in a sense, the process, and in a sense make the process sacred, and hopefully have a good process so that people can speak and express, and we can come to decisions that we live with without killing each other. And we live in the United States and Canada, which that's about 70% of the viewers that watch my channel. We live in a society where we've been very successful at not killing each other for a fairly long time. And that's a good thing. And that's a thing we very much want to preserve. So then the question comes, should the church be used to pursue a political outcome? Now, here's the way, and some of these things have pushed my C.S. Lewis video on morality a little bit out of the way, but it is coming. Should the church be used to pursue political outcome? Should. Well, there's the word right there. Some of you will have a feeling yes. Some of you will have a feeling no. A lot of us will have the feeling that depends on if the church agrees with me. If the church agrees with me, I want it to pursue a political outcome. If the church disagrees with me, I don't want it to pursue a political outcome. And what happens then is that the church becomes a proxy in our political ambitions and of our political opinions. And as a minister in the church, I have to think long and hard about this, and especially as a pastor, because it is easy, because of my position in a small church like this and my influence within the church, it is easy to try to make the church a projection or even an expression of my political viewpoints. And as a pastor, my position has always been no. In my congregation, there are Democrats and Republicans. There are people who are very conservative Republicans, and there are people who are very liberal Democrats, and we're all in the same church, and I believe that's the way it should be. And as I get into this video, you'll see a little bit more about that. But this question, should the church be used to pursue a political outcome? And we say, well, that depends. Now, one of the first things you have to back up and say, well, what is religion? There are many religions in the world where this is not a question. Certain takes on Hinduism or Buddhism say that the material world as we see it is illusory. And I've been getting into this question of illusion and perception and the material world in my videos on C.S. Lewis and Jordan Peterson and that whole conversation. But there are some religions in the world that say we're living in the midst of an illusion. If you want expression of that, you can listen to some of the best music from one of my favorite bands, Kansas. We're dust in the wind, baby, where we see this illusion. It's the grand illusion. Well, Christianity doesn't say that. Christianity says that that Jesus comes to save the world, and the meek will inherit the earth. And Christianity says that all of these things are important, that God cares, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. I mean, Christianity is invested in history. So it is not a religion that is escapist. And now I've been having some email conversations with people over heaven versus the new heavens and the new earth, what eschatology looks at. eschatology gets involved in all of this stuff, and you can see some of my Easter sermons for where I stand on this. But to contextualize this, I want to talk about what I often call the first century culture war. And this is in Galilee and Judea, in the place where Jesus lived and where Jesus did his ministry. The Bible is the story in some ways of a very frustrated, failed people in terms of their national sovereignty. And that people are the people of Israel. Israel was repressed and oppressed by the major empires for hundreds of years. And if you watch my Sunday school lessons, I go through this history again and again and again because it is foundational for understanding the story of the Bible. The geopolitical reality of the Israelite homeland between Mesopotamia and Egypt meant that it would perpetually become a pawn for the greater empires. You had the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia. Their cities would always have better production for food and therefore bigger armies, and they could dominate the region, and the same goes for Egypt. Because of this, geopolitically, Israel, where she was located in that little Jordan River Valley, did not stand a chance, generally speaking, against the greater empires that arose. And if you read the Bible, she's first subjugated by Egypt, and then the Assyrian Empire wipes out the northern kingdom of Israel, and the Babylonian Empire enslaves the southern kingdom of Israel. And after the Babylonians come the Persians, after the Persians come the Greeks, after the Greeks come the Romans. And Israel is oppressed and repressed politically, religiously, economically for most of her history. And she's doing all of this while she has a very unusual culture and religion. Well, it's not unusual that she's imagined to be at the center of it, but somehow in the process of imperial domination by foreign powers, Israel flips the script on the broader cultural assumption about what political subjugation means. And this is why, again, I've been in the book of Ezekiel for almost a year now, and I've got all those videos online, and I've got my videos about the book of Daniel online. But instead of kind of turning over, as most nations did, and simply assume and assimilate the gods of the victors, Israel imagines a very different story, where her God is calling the shots over the gods of the victorious empires. And again, I've talked a lot about this in my Ezekiel class, and I'll put the link to those classes in the notes as well. So when we find Israel in Jesus' time, she is being subjugated by Rome. And what Rome wants out of Israel is order and taxes. And Israel isn't really an important area for Rome. Rome wants to keep the seacoast going from Egypt to Rome free of hostilities, because that's where Rome gets its grain supply, from Egypt and from North Africa. So, but geopolitically, it's not that big of a deal. But it's a huge deal, obviously, for the people of Galilee and Judea. And even though right now in the West we might think, well, we are having a culture war, the culture war of the first century was quite a bit more tense, quite a bit more violent, quite a bit more bloody than the culture war that, as we call it, in the United States or in Canada today. Now, Israel was anticipating deliverance. And so you go back to Genesis 12, and they were God's chosen people, the children of Abraham, and God was going to bless the world through them. This is an audacious vision. God promised to keep David's line alive and in charge. And so when we pick up the story in the first century in the Galilee and in Judea, which are Roman provinces, now under the subjugation of the Roman Empire, under their client states and their client kings like the Herods, Israel is chafing under this, and they are working the existential religious question: is God still there? Does God still love us? Now, this is not a foreign question to many of you. Many people, when tragedy strikes their life, they say, well, I just can't believe in a God because my life has been so hard. Other people can't not believe in a God because their life is so hard. But Israel as a nation is struggling through this. We have all these amazing promises about God delivering us, and when is it going to happen? And they're not just waiting 1 year or a few months or a few decades, hundreds of years of subjugation. And this is why I think the Israelites should be the world's most determined people, because they managed to hold on to their culture and their religion. And now it continues to change and morph over time, but they managed to hold on to it through centuries of subjugation. Now, it's helpful to understand how, and obviously many other peoples are subjugated by Rome, but the way most of those other people manage this religiously and politically is via, in a sense, the lubrication of polytheism. So you've got your national god, maybe you're a Babylonian and you've been conquered by the Persians. So you take in some of the Persians' gods, but you keep your gods, and maybe they mix together, and you have your family gods and your household gods. So whenever you get conquered, yeah, it's another new religious layer, and maybe our new overlords will require us to have this particular religion and to comply with this particular cult for the nation. But we can do that because everybody understands, yeah, politics and religion are really like this in the ancient world, but it's polytheism kind of keeps them lubricated. And okay, so I got to add another god. Well, what is this god going to cost me? Okay, I got to go to the temple and give a sacrifice, but I can continue my own private cult and my altar in my house, and so on and so forth. And this is, in a sense, how the ancient world manages politics and religion. Israel steps out of this, and Israel doesn't do this. And this makes the book of Daniel, made the book of Daniel very popular in Jesus' day. And if you, again, I've got a video series on the book of Daniel that you can watch. The book of Daniel is all about politics, and it's all about subjugation, and it's all about God's, the book of Daniel is kind of like Pacific Rim with a very different religious background, because the monsters come out of the sea, but the Ancient of Days, puts down the monsters, and the Son of Man comes and is given an eternal kingdom. That's the story of the apocalyptic portion of the book of Daniel. And again, in previous videos, I've talked about what apocalyptic literature is. So the book of Daniel is a very favorite book. And so the people who are under Roman subjugation are anxious for the new David, the Messiah, the Son of Man to come. And actually, during this period in Israelite history, there were many who rose up to be messiahs of one form or another. In fact, Herod the Great wanted to appropriate this narrative for himself, which was part of the reason he rebuilt the temple. He wanted to be seen, even though he was an Edomite and not fully Israelite, he wanted to be seen as the Messiah, but he was not popularly embraced by the different factions of the people. And this is the issue. Israel is under subjugation. They have one threat to face, but they're human beings. They are divided as to the approach of the threat. Now, what you'll see in the division of these factions are some of the major ways that people deal with the threat. One way is to attack. One way is to avoid. One way is to equivocate and nuance and schmooze and try to work both sides. It's basically the basic options we have. So Israelites couldn't agree about how to get free of the Romans. They believed they had God's promises, but now we get into this question, does following God mean I act or I wait? So the Zealots, their tactic was kill the Romans, knife them if we can. And there's a lot of debate, but it's possible that Judas was part of the zealotry party or faction in the first century culture war. The Essenes were out in bunkers in the desert or caves. They weren't bunkers, they were caves, but it's the same idea. And their strategy was pray in the desert caves until God nukes the Romans and anyone who's guilty by association, because the Essenes believed that actually participating in society made you a Roman supremacist. And if you did anything with the Romans, you were a Roman supremacist, and their holy God was going to smite you for being a Roman supremacist. So the safest strategy was to stay way out in the desert, live in your caves, stay as far away from the Romans as possible, pray, 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 pray until God nukes the Romans, and then you come out of your bunker and you inherit the earth. So the bunkered inherit the earth. That was the Essene strategy, and there's some reason to believe, and there's conversation whether John the Baptist had lived as an Essene. He was part of a monastic movement. Now, I'm using the Essenes. There were likely multiple monastic movements who all had their rival visions of their particulars about how this would all take place, but their basic strategy was avoid. So the Zealots attacked violently, the Essenes avoided, and then you had your accommodationists, who were the aristocracy, and some of the Sadducees. And their argument was, hey, you got to live. And the Romans are large and in charge now, so baby, make the best of it in a bad situation. Work with the Romans. Get what we can. And if the Romans give us power, if we get wealth in the process, so be it. So they were really the accommodationists, and they worked with the Romans. Now the Pharisees, who you hear a lot of when you read the canonical Gospels, they were really kind of the moderate party. They were working the nuances. In some ways, I liken them to, if you look at the American culture war, now don't overreact by what I'm about to say. In some ways, the Pharisees are kind of like American evangelicals in terms of how they deal with this politics and religion. And it's kind of a both and when it comes to it. Now, it's important to note in terms of American history that we get into fundamentalism, evangelicalism. There's a lot of history back there, but especially in the 1980s with the religious right, American evangelicals kind of came roaring into politics and became a political force. And that's really the context when we hear evangelicals talked about in secular news. And there's a huge amount of debate about that label. It's a world of conversation that I can't get into right now. But the Pharisees tried to nuance the political and religious. So they were political moderates in that they wanted the Romans out, and they believed God was going to take out the Romans, but they were still living in the world but not of the world. And so part of the way that they resisted Roman culture and Roman cultural genocide, which is really Hellenism, Greek cultural genocide, which had been a factor in the Galilee and in Judea since before the Romans, all the way back to the occupation of the Greeks, where you get the intertestamental books like the Maccabees. How do we resist the Romans? Well, we're not going to go out into the caves. We're not going to knife them. We are going to pray. We're religiously observant. We're going to pray that God send his Messiah, and we're going to obey the law. We're going to follow the law. And see, then they hearken back to the book of Chronicles and the book of Kings and the prophets, because they read the scriptures and they know that God sent Babylon to punish Israel for her idolatry. And so if there's going to do anything, they're not going to be idolatrous. So they're really reactive about the temple, and no foreign images, and no idolatry, and no blasphemy. And the way you keep the law is you hedge the Torah, and you make sure that you don't violate the Torah. So you're very scrupulous about what you eat. Now the Romans may demand their taxes, and you got to tolerate the Roman troops. But what you do in the confines of your own home and how you teach your own children, well, this is where we can have some autonomy. So we are going to maintain our ceremonial purity. We're going to observe the law, and we're going to follow it to a T, so that God will free us from the Roman tyranny. And their imagination, how God would free them, was flexible enough that it could include pragmatic political liberation, or it could include apocalyptic angels, divine intervention, the kind of stuff you read about in the book of Revelation. So they're in a sense in the moderates. And so if things get better, fine. If God comes in and wipes them out, sending a new David who will mobilize them, kind of in the style of the Maccabees, if you read the book of the Maccabees, mobilize them and kick out the Romans, fine. If the resurrection comes, great. We'll be vindicated. So this is the Pharisees. And what's interesting is that it's, in many ways, the Pharisees were closest to Jesus, and it's almost always the case that you have the most heated political enemies are the ones closest to you, because we can deal with an enemy, but we really hate betrayal and we really hate the traitor. And so Jesus and the Pharisees in some ways are very close, and the Pharisees are, initially they're hoping that they can recruit Jesus because he would be a powerful ally for their cause. And to their great frustration and eventual anger enough to turn him over to their enemies to be killed, to their great frustration, Jesus refuses to be recruited by them. And Jesus resists their recruitment, and Jesus says and does things which make him poison to their movement. So Jesus comes along, and he's kind to Romans and their collaborators. Now, this kindness to sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes and the slave needs of a Roman centurion, this aspect of Jesus' ministry usually gets interpreted within our culture war as Jesus being the friend of the oppressed. Now, that is true, because you can appropriate, I think you can legitimately appropriate the message of the prophets and the words of Jesus to see that Jesus is against oppression. And that's good. I think we should all be against oppression. Jesus is against oppression because oppression is sin. Now, what we should be a little bit careful of is probably increase the resolution on the Jesus you're reading to realize that part of the culture war that meant ostracizing prostitutes and tax collectors was that this was a way that they could resist the Roman occupation, and this is a way that they could resist cultural genocide, and this is the way that they could resist the sex trade, because this is what was going on. And part of the reason tax collectors and prostitutes were ostracized by their own people was because they were ceremonially unclean by their contact with the pagans, and they also were seen as collaborating with the Roman oppression. And you can see shades of this after World War II, where after the war, Dutch women who slept with German soldiers and probably slept with German soldiers to get food, maybe even food for their children or food for their family. These women were treated as enemies and traitors because they slept with the other side. And so, it's really easy and convenient to look at Jesus' mercy and say, see, Jesus is on the side of the oppressed, and he is. But what you have to pay attention to is when you're using something as abstract as oppressed, this is a very handy tool to put on whoever you want to. And the way the political game gets played is that you define oppressed and oppressor, and this is the postmodern critique, you define oppressed and oppressor based on whatever filter you wish to employ, which may in fact just simply be a motivation within you trying to exert itself for your own well-being at the expense of the world. So was Jesus kind to tax collectors and prostitutes and outcasts and beggars? Yeah. There's also some very inconvenient stories about Jesus, like when he's talking to the Syrophoenician woman and she asks for help and he refers to her as a dog. Now, I know most of you love dogs, but many of the people of the world and the people at that time did not respect dogs. Dogs were mangy, dirty scavengers that you used to clean up the garbage around the neighborhood. And when I lived in the Dominican Republic, dogs were these skittish things at the border, and if a dog got in, you kicked him. That's how dogs were treated, and Jesus calls this woman a dog, and that leads to an entire conversation. And I've seen friends of mine who are on the religious left use this as a reason why, the religious allegiance that conservative Christians show to the Bible is misplaced because of this story about Jesus. Well, here's the difficulty. If you selectively undercut the authority of the Bible, that game can be played by anyone too. And so this is why a lot of conservative Christians try to maintain the authority of the Bible, but of course, how the Bible should be read, and in what respects is it authoritative? That gets into a whole nother conversations. There are no easy conversations in this. I don't think there ever have been. And the more you know, the more you realize how complex all of this is, and how you have to try to weed through it. So anyway, Jesus is kind to Romans and their collaborators, and this causes tensions with Zealots, Essenes, and Pharisees because they're against the Romans. And Jesus seems to be soft on the sex trade, and soft on the occupation, and soft on corruption, and soft on cultural genocide. The Romans and the Greeks before them were practicing cultural genocide. If you're a Roman and a Greek or a good Hellenist, maybe you tolerated those Jews because they did a favor for Julius Caesar, but on the whole, they were a pain in the neck because they just didn't get along. And this has been the story of the Jewish people throughout history. They stand apart. And if there's something we don't trust, it's an outsider. And so, Jesus was then suspect, and Jesus refused to play in their culture war games. And that made Jesus their enemy. So Jesus also, with his 12 disciples, now, again, if you've listened to some of my other stuff, you know that historically we know Jesus' group was larger than 12. But why did Jesus choose 12 disciples? And why were they men? Well, I'm not going to get into the man thing right now. Why were they all Jews? I'm not going to get in. Well, because the 12 disciples obviously connect. 12 disciples, 12 tribes. You get to the book of Revelation, you have 24, which is 12 plus 12. They loved, numbers were really important symbolically. So these 12 disciples in some ways represent Jesus' new community as new Israel. And the Gospel of Matthew majors on that theme. So Jesus comes along and he's kind to Romans and their collaborators, but he's also religiously observant. Now, mostly because one of the things, again, when I was in college and kind of working out Christianity for myself, one of the things that I was frustrated with is how much conversation there is in the Gospels about all kinds of things I didn't care about. Conversations about Sabbath observance, conversations about ritual observance, conversations about washing your hands, conversations about fasting. And I'm thinking, this is supposed to be a spiritual book and we're talking about this stuff that seems to make no sense? Well, it makes sense if you understand the first century culture war, because these were the hot issues between Jesus and the Pharisees. And so what Jesus seems to intentionally do sometimes is go out of his way to do things to pick fights with the Pharisees. And the fights he's picking are for sermonic reasons. And the same thing goes for his miracles. His miracles are not, ooh, look at me, I have power. His miracles are acted out sermons. And they illustrate the life of the age to come and the life of the kingdom of God / heaven. And so everything Jesus does embodies and teaches what his entire ministry is about. So you have to watch the whole thing. So even if you get tired of reading about these fights about Sabbath observance and ceremonial cleanliness keeping, if you understand them within the culture war, you begin to understand how Jesus is playing this. And essentially, Jesus is refusing to align with any of the factions all the time. There are moments when he is seen to align with some factions, which makes the other factions unhappy. For example, it doesn't appear that Jesus is on the Roman radar. And so the Romans are pragmatists and, actually have a fairly decent system of justice if you can overlook the slavery and the imperialism. But that's the way it always is. We always have our selective filters. So Jesus isn't even on their radar. Now, the triumphal entry, that would have caught their attention. And then when he's brought to trial before Pilate, who is a petty, corrupt Roman official put in there to try to keep peace and order in that rather unsettled part of the world, Pilate says, we don't really have a case against this guy. This is a religious dispute, but he has to keep political peace, and so it's easier to kill Jesus than to, and you can win political favors that way. This is politically expedient. So Jesus, here's the amazing thing. All of the factions that are going on in the first century culture war, when Jesus is ministering, they all hate each other. But if you want to get an idea of how warped our idealistic image of Jesus is, these people could agree on nothing, but they could agree that the world would be better with Jesus shut up and dead. What does that say about Jesus? What does that say about our idealistic notions, whether on the right or the left, of Jesus as this freedom warrior, or on the right, Jesus as this, morally virtuous teacher? Now, was Jesus a freedom warrior? Yes, in his way. Was he morally virtuous teacher? Yes, in his way. He was both kind to Romans and Roman collaborators and religiously observant. And if you listen to Tim Keller talk, you'll hear him say all the time, Jesus, if you're actually reading the Bible, you're going to have problems usually with both sides of a political debate. You're not going to fit in. Why won't you fit in? Partly because of how this whole thing is framed, because you're actually trying to fit into another layer of the conversation that is hard to live with at the practical level. I remember Jon Stewart on the Daily Show once. Jon Stewart was a secular Jew, and somebody made a comment once that I look like Jon Stewart with a beard. Well, I'm about a foot taller than Jon Stewart, but we did grow up in New Jersey at about the same time and place. So, but I don't have as good a sense of humor as he does. But Jon Stewart makes the comment, about Jesus. He says, do you read this man? Do you hear what he says? Do you read the Sermon on the Mount? This guy, he simply doesn't fit in. Now, if you sit back and think about that long enough, you would say, probably any real image of God is not going to fit in easily with all of the ways that we compromise everything. So, Jesus is religiously observant, mostly. He affirms God's work in history. He works miracles. He talks about the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of God, and he identifies as the Son of Man in Daniel 7. Now that's important because now we see some of Jesus' revolutionary side. If you read, for example, Luke, in Luke, the Song of Mary, which is a redux of the Song of Hannah from the book of 1 Samuel, Jesus is a revolutionary, but what Jesus is overturning is revolution. And this is why Jesus is not a communist, because if you're a communist, you believe in revolution, and the kind of revolution Jesus fight is not like any kind of revolution we see in this world. Jesus is turning over revolution. Well, how do you turn over revolution without revolution? Well, there's the question. And that is exactly what Jesus is going to enact. And someone might say, yeah, when you do that, you get yourself killed, which is exactly what happens to Jesus. But now in Daniel 7, the beasts that come out of the sea are put down by the Ancient of Days, who sets up thrones, and the Son of Man comes with the clouds, and he's given an eternal kingdom. So Jesus comes onto the scene of the first century culture war, and Jesus basically says, he doesn't say he's the Son of God, because that would go all different ways he's not looking to send it. He says he's the Son of Man, and he identifies as the Son of Man. Now, the Romans aren't going to pick up on this, but the observant Jews who know their scriptures will, and they know the book of Daniel. And so Jesus will be seen by his disciple as many as a revolutionary, but he's just so confusing. He just doesn't fit into their categories. And so if he's, He's in trouble with the scribes and the Pharisees, and his disciples don't understand him. He doesn't fit into anyone's frame of reference. He doesn't fit into anyone's easy political box. So then Jesus dies, is raised, ascended, and as I go through my Easter series and get into Ascension, I'll be talking about these things. Jesus' followers, however, are, you follow Paul, the book of Acts, out into the Roman Empire. They don't participate in the civic cults, which are assumed to be part of the good citizens of the city. Everyone is used to the Jews not fitting in, and so they kind of get a pass. And at this point, Jews are about 10% of the Roman Empire, which is a sizable margin. They had flourished quite a bit, actually, in the intertestamental period, which if you'll go back and you see the beginning of the book of Exodus, seems to be a sign of God's favor. So they flourish quite a bit, but the relationship with the Roman Empire is always troubled because they don't fit in. They're not going to go to the pagan temples. They're not going to participate in this political lubrication of polytheism, because in the ancient world, politics and religion are one thing. And that could itself be a very long and deep conversation. So the Jews don't fit in. And then you have this, what appears to the Romans to be a Jewish faction initially, but they're at war with the Jewish leaders. And they're Jews too. So Paul is a Jew among Jews, and he's at war with the Jewish leaders. And so when the Apostle Paul goes into a city, he either gets in trouble with the Romans, or he gets in trouble with the other people of the synagogue who want him to shut up, and it usually ends in a stoning or a riot or something or another, and Paul gets thrown in prison. And Paul will eventually also be killed by the Roman Empire, as will Peter. So, this whole history is fraught with violence and politics, but they don't participate, and they look like a Jewish splinter group, but they are strangely diverse. And this is very unlike the synagogues that they're coming out of. There are men and women relating in a different way. There are slave and free, which is probably the big dividing line in the Roman Empire. Slave and free are relating in a different way. Read the book of Philemon. Very short book. If you don't like reading long books, read the book of Philemon. And they're from different nations. Now, again, everyone was assumed that you get your religion from your nation. The Jews have the Jewish religion. The Babylonians have the Babylonian religion. The Egyptians have the Egyptian religions. The Romans have the Roman religion. Now, if Rome comes in and takes over your city, they might say, put up a statue to something or other, or at least participate faithfully in the civic cult. Show yourself to be a good citizen. And so that's how the lubrication of polytheism worked in the Roman Empire. And here these Christians aren't participating in that. And you've got men and women, slave and free, Jews and Gentiles, all coming together in this church. And this is a surprise also to the very early church. And so they sent Paul and Barnabas up to Antioch. And in Antioch, the relationship between the different nations was so fraught that they had walls inside the city to keep the cosmopolitan city, keep the ethnic factions within the city from killing each other. And so here in the church, some of these people are mingling together, and they're calling themselves brother and sister. Now, these are words that you use for tribal people. And so you've got your identity markers of family and religion all running together. And that's why in Antioch, they get called Christians, because they don't know what else to call them, because they're not fitting into the larger Roman frame of reference. Now, this develops and goes all the way to Constantine. There's a whole lot of history I don't have time to go through, but obviously when Constantine embraces Christianity, Arian Christianity, which means he wasn't a Trinitarian, Constantine embraces Christianity, and he makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and estimates are that maybe at this point a third of the Roman Empire were practicing Christians of one sort or another, and Christianity itself was already a pretty diverse pot in terms of the theological struggles that were going on. But that then changes the game, because now the political relationship between Christianity and politics is different from what it had been when Christianity is kind of this Jewish sect that's out there growing amongst the Roman population. And then you have to figure out, well, how then is the church and the emperor going to relate? And then as history goes, the Roman Empire will crumble, and in some ways the church takes over and is the last institution standing, because many of the barbarians coming in are Christians. A lot of people don't realize that in the sack of Rome, the very famous sack of Rome, Rome was sacked by barbarians. And when we hear that, we think, oh, these, pagan people. Well, actually, the barbarians who sacked Rome were Christians. They were Arian Christians, meaning that they were not fully Trinitarian, but they were Christians, and they slaughtered people in pagan temples. But when even pagans ran into Christian churches, they respected the Christian churches. Why? Because they were Christians. And this is something that is usually overlooked. And then Augustine, of course, writes The City of God, which is a foundationally important work for the history of civilization and Christianity in there, and talks about the city of God and the city of man. And right away with Augustine, he's working on this relationship between, well, what is the relationship between Jesus and the empire, between Jesus and the emperor, and between God and politics? This conversation has been going on from the very beginning of the Bible. It starts in... We will never be free of this conversation. It will always be a difficult conversation. It's a difficult conversation now. We should have the conversation. Let's talk a little bit about eschatology. Eschatology means the doctrine of last things. Now, right now, eschatology is the most indeterminate aspect of Christian theology. It has to deal with the future. Okay, there are three major buckets that Christians tend to fall into when it comes to eschatology, and I'm going to contextualize these mostly in terms of North America. There are the postmillennials. Now, the postmillennialism had its heyday at the end of the 19th century in the optimism of end of 19th century modernity. We can change the world through science. You had a bunch of very interesting post-millennial sects coming up out of the burned over country in upstate New York. Post-millennialism imagines that human progress is going to continue. This gets into American politics in the progressive era, where you have the move towards, after the success of abolition in the American Civil War, that gives rise to a lot of human optimism about history's future. Read and look at the lyrics to the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The American Civil War was God's war, where he frees the slaves. Now, this gets very tricky, and it's important to be self-conscious about this language and self-conscious about these narratives. So in the wake of the success of the abolition movement at the end of the Civil War, the guild that leads to the Gilded Age and the progressive movement. So you have, in a sense, women's suffrage, which is early women's liberation. You have the Reconstruction era in the American South, where you have black you have black politicians now coming out of slavery. Jim Crow will come to squash the Reconstruction. The Reconstruction is set. I'm not going to get into too much American history here, but know your American history. So after the Civil War, you have now we're learning science. Darwin comes on the scene. We've got the Industrial Revolution. We've got the Scientific Revolution. We believe there's no end to what we can do, and religion goes along with the cultural movement, and the church begins to imagine that things are just going to get better and better, and we're going to bring in the kingdom of God. And so you have rise of secularism and a secularist religion in which the world's going to get better and better and better, and the kingdom of God is going to come. Okay, that gets ground into the muddy battlefields of Belgium and France in the First World War. Think, for example, Woodrow Wilson, the great progressive. His progressive death dies with the demise of the League of Nations. So post-mill. Now this is very complicated because there's lots of subsections, and some of you will say, "Well, I'm post-mill, but I'm this." Cool. Post-millennialism imagines that history gets better and better, and it's capped off by the kingdom of God. And so for some post-mills, we bring in the kingdom. This is progressivism, okay? And progressivism has very deep roots to Christianity, because in some ways you can very much look at Christianity as a progressivistic religion, because Christianity imagines progressive revelation. Again, these are enormously long and complex conversations. I'm just going to name some things. I'm not going to go into them. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with these debates, I'm sorry, maybe we'll get around to it. There's only so much time to learn so much history. There's pre-mills. Now, in the American context and the British context and in the English language world, and now more and more in the developing world, many of those pre-mills are dispensationalists. And that's a whole nother conversation about dispensationalism. I am not a dispensationalist. If you read the Left Behind series, that's an expression of dispensational eschatology with the rapture and so on and so forth. And again, Christians have been fighting about this stuff for years in-house. Basically, the pre-mill narrative says that things get worse and worse, and then Jesus intervenes. And so the post-mill says things get better and better, and either God ushers in the kingdom at the end of a lot of long progress. The pre-mill says God intervenes and brings in his kingdom at the end of long, long decline. Now, if you talk to people, you hear both of these narratives. Some people say, well, the world is getting better and better. Look at my cell phone. Look at driverless cars. Look at the internet. Look at advances in medicine. Look at, how many people getting lifted out of poverty. The world is getting better and better. Other people say the world is getting worse and worse. And then they select their moral complaints or their ecological complaints or, whatever. So sometimes, and I think this is a function of consciousness, we tend to be only able in a moment to see one thing at a time. So when we're looking at certain selective things, we say the world is getting better and better. Woohoo, good for us. We look at other things, we say, oh, the world is getting worse and worse. We look at them. This is part of the reason I'm Amil, which is the third bucket. Which says that the millennium, which is a 1,000-year reign that's in the book of Revelation. You can go to the Bible Project and look at the book of Revelation and how they nuance it. But, the 1,000 years in the book of Revelation is symbolic. Okay. What does that mean? Well, Amil basically punts and says, we don't know. So then they bank on texts that say Jesus comes like a thief in the night and nobody's ready. And it comes like the flood in Noah's day and nobody's ready. So Amils kind of take a step back and say, I ain't going to pick. And so now historically, pre-mills tended to be more American mainline, or post-mills tended to be American mainline. Pre-mills tended to be American fundamentalist. Some Pentecostals, some evangelicals. Amils tend to be Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, Reformed. So that'll give you a little bit of orientation. Again, these are enormous conversations that I just want to touch on and mention to give a little bit of orientation. I haven't forgotten our main question: should your pastor tell you who to vote for? The Synod of the Christian Reformed Church is going to meet this June. And this happens every year in the Christian Reformed Church. We have a meeting called Synod. And the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church is the broadest assembly. There are 4 delegates from each classis. Classis is the regional assembly, and council is the local assembly. The Christian Reformed Church polity, which is the structure of the organization, has 3 levels. There's a local level, there's a regional level, and there's a binational level. And the Christian Reformed Church in North America is made up of the denomination that is in the U.S. and Canada. And that's part of the reason why I know so many Canadian pastors, because the denomination crosses this border. And this is because of historical reasons of Dutch immigration. So now the way that these assemblies relate is also a little complicated. The assemblies are supposed to have their own autonomous authorities. So the authority of the broader assembly is derived from the local authority. And you can see that a long conversation in terms of how churches organize themselves. The Christian Reformed Church tries to balance congregationalism and denominationalism. And the Christian Reformed people are always talking about, are we getting this balance right? Often the middle group, classis, doesn't get a lot of attention or has a lot of power because it's the least, well, let's get into all kinds of other things that I talk about a lot. So anyway, there's 3 assemblies in the Christian Reformed Church, and Synod is the broadest. So 4 delegates from each region, about 48 classes. So we'll descend upon Grand Rapids in June, and they're going to make decisions about the whole church. One of the things that again, that gets into the 3 layers. One of the things that Synod spends a lot of time doing is managing its agencies, which are agencies and efforts that are joint work of all of the churches. And this is funded through ministry shares, which is contributions from local churches up to Synod. And there's a lot of ministries that go on there. There's church planting in North America. There's mission work overseas. One thing that doesn't get ministry shares, but is actually the best funded agency, is an organization called World Renew, which does relief and development overseas and does especially relief, disaster relief in the United States and Canada. And they're a terrific organization, and they do wonderful work, and they're in fact the most popular organization of all the Christian Reformed agencies. But you have the question, what work should the church do? Now, part of how Synod operates is that classes, who are the regional bodies, local church councils, who are the local assemblies, or individual Christian Reformed Church members may ask Synod to take action on something. And the form you do that is by sending what's called an overture. And so one of the things that Synod does, besides hearing reports and overseeing budgets and doing all the business of the church, is to receive overtures from the churches. And Synod hears these requests and decides what to do with it. Synod gives an idea. It's always interesting to see what overtures come to Synod, because it gives you a sense of what's on the mind of people of the churches. It's kind of a way to sample what's going on. Now, for the last number of years, one of the organizations of the church that has been one of the sharpest focus is the Office of Social Justice. Now, I know for a lot of my Jordan Peterson listeners, you're already got reactive, okay? Let's just own our reactivity and settle down and talk about this. So the Office of Social Justice. Now this is, I don't know, 2-3% of the denominational budget. It's a very, very small office, but it's been getting a lot of attention in terms of the Christian Reformed Church, partly because this topic of politics and religion is very hot in our culture right now. And so a lot of people have issues with the Office of Social Justice. Should it exist at all? And especially, what issues should it deal with? And this, again, we get back to the earlier conversation where, well, I don't think the church should be involved in politics except for the politics that I think it should be involved with. And this has happened to a certain degree with the Office of Social Justice. You look along the bottom here, you have immigration, creation care, religious persecution, abortion, poverty and hunger, restorative justice, okay? Immigration and creation care seem like issues on the left politically. Religious persecution and abortion, these are issues on the right politically. Poverty and hunger, everyone seems to be concerned with. They just have different ways of addressing it. And restorative justice, well, that depends what you mean by justice. And so the Office of Social Justice becomes a football. And a number of years ago, there was a lot of complaining that the Office of Social Justice wasn't paying enough attention to right-wing political issues. And so they, okay, we're adjusting the legs of the table. So we're going to add a little bit more on the right wing, and we're going to try and keep a balance. And other people are saying, we shouldn't even be in this game. Other people are saying, we should be more in this game. Aren't we against racism? Aren't we against sex trafficking? Aren't we against, but it all depends on which political interests they are. Now, they possess. Now here's the question. Ought the church to be politically diverse? Now, I said earlier in the video that my particular very small congregation is politically diverse, and I've got my own political ideas. I have for a long time. I've always been interested in politics. I've also always been skeptical about what politics can achieve. And so people will say to me, well, what do you believe in? I believe in God, and I'm skeptical about politics. That's the reverse of a lot of people. A lot of people are skeptical about God and believe in politics. Well, I think actually those two things are together. And the more you believe in God, that's going to change how you relate politically. Because in my experience, when people lose God, politics becomes their God. And that then leads to some of the dynamics I spoke about in my last video, some of the stuff that Miroslav Volf has written about, that when God is gone, inheriting this world makes all the difference in the world. And so the meek will never inherit it, but the strong will inherit it. And I think this gets very much into who Jesus was and what he did. Now, if you go back over my sermons, and I've got my sermons recorded for about 10 years. At some point, I should put them all online. Most of them are audio recordings. But I think Jesus fundamentally changes how we go about politics. As I said earlier, Jesus upturns revolution. And he does so at the cost of his life. Now, that's not a political price most of us are willing to pay. And that's why Jesus is, in Jordan Peterson terms, archetypal. Because there's no bigger price to pay than your life. That's the biggest price you can pay. And so the thing that you give your life to is the thing of ultimate value. It's easy to give somebody else's life for what you care about, but to give your own, well, now we're talking. So at this particular synod, and now I'm using this as an introduction to a conversation I'm going to have this afternoon, which I'm going to do as a separate video. So those of you who see this other video come up and don't understand it, come back to this one. I don't know why I just told you that, because you're already in the other video. There are 3 overtures that are coming to Synod. And Synod's going to have to decide what to do with the 3. Overture 12 says, foster discussion and education focused on the biblical principles for public discipleship. Well, what does that mean? Well, this is the tricky thing about education. Well, I'm going to educate you into, well, aren't all my videos about education? We should teach people, does this overture ask, should we teach people how to vote? Because teaching people how to vote and telling people how to vote is pretty much the same thing. Should we say you should always vote for the Democrats? You should always vote for the Republicans? You should always vote for the Libertarians? I don't know Canadian politics well enough, but 2 of the 3 people I'm going to talk to this afternoon are, one grew up in Canada, ministers in the U.S. The other grew up in Canada and lives in Canada. And the third one is originally from Iowa and lives, the pastor and the lawyer both live in Oregon. And the Canadian pastor lives in Ontario. So we're gonna look at the U.S. and Canada. And part of what's been happening in this conversation that the CRC is having is this is putting tension on binationality. And this is part of the reason, for the Jordan Peterson watchers, because I'm a part of the Christian Reformed Church, I've got a lot of connections into Canada, and I know a little something about Canada, more than most Americans. I don't know as much about Canada as most Canadians know about the United States, and that's a whole nother conversation. So the first Overture 12 says, foster political discussion. Overture 13 says, instruct agencies to refrain from political advocacy. And that comes from a very vocal, conservative, boy, I could get into real trouble with this, but I'm going to say it anyway. In some ways, Classis Minn-Kota is kind of the Tea Party Classis of the Christian Reformed Church. They are loud and conservative, and they come to every. I think they sit down at every Classis meeting and say, "What overture can we send to Synod?" And that's who Classis Minn-Kota are. And I know some of my listeners would feel very much at home with them. Some of my other listeners would get very nervous by them, but that's who they are. So they just have an overture, cut political advocacy. Let's just stay out of the whole thing completely. The third overture, Overture 14, was written by two of the people that are going to be on my conversation this afternoon, about instruct CRC agencies and ministries to stop political lobbying on behalf of the Christian Reformed Church. That one tends to be a little bit more nuanced. And I'll put a link to the Acts of Synod if any of you really want to read that book. I'll put a link to it. It's free online. Part of the value of what church should be is transparent to the outside world. I think we should be transparent because I think we should be transparent. So I'll put it online. But this is going to be the debate. Where is religion and politics? And like I've showed you, this is a debate that goes throughout human history. And in many ways, the American experiment was an attempt to say, we're going to go like this with religion and politics. And the word God does not appear in the American Constitution. Now, God appeared in a lot of state constitutions, but God doesn't appear in the federal Constitution. And America came out of the Enlightenment where they're trying to get beyond the internal Christian European wars. And so the decision was, we're not going to fight about, mostly there were a lot of Protestants, we're not going to fight about infant baptism in the federal government. We're not going to kill Quakers. We're not going to replay the Anglican civil wars. We're not going to do that. So you have no establishment of a state church. But then, of course, then you're going to have to deal with what you're going to do with, say, Muslims when they come in, with Jews when they come in, and then gasp, the Roman Catholics when they came in. And the history of the relationship between American politics and Roman Catholicism is itself a very interesting and complicated history. If you look at, I think one of the most interesting things is look at the composition of the Supreme Court. Look at their religious composition, and the lack of Protestants. That, an observer of American history would find that quite something. Part of that being, all this history is so long and complicated. But anyway, this is all hard. But this boils down to a question also of organic and institutional church. The organic church is like the body of Christ, this group of people. And the institutional church is this machinery, these laws and rules and polity and policy and all of these things. So now, should Christians participate in politics? Most Christian groups right now in America say yes. 150 years ago, many Christian groups in America, they wouldn't vote because politics was dirty. And so, their posture was more like an Essene. We're going to stay out of dirty politics and keep our hands clean and free of this kind of entanglement. But of course, there's a lot of ways to manage that and to nuance that. So should Christians participate in politics? The Christian Reformed Church is in a line with the Reformed tradition, has always said, Our citizenship is part of our duty to God, so we should participate in politics as individuals. But now the next question, should the church as institution make political statements? Now this is difficult because what is a political statement? Is saying, I believe CO2 is heating and cooking the world and poisoning the oceans. Is that a political statement? Is saying, I think marriage is between a man and a woman. Is that a political statement? Is saying, I think the Syrian civil war is a tragedy and we should do everything we can for those poor people dislocated by that war. Is that a political statement? Is saying Jesus is Lord a political statement? It certainly was in the Roman Empire. So we have difficulty even agreeing on what a political statement is. Does the church as an institution have expertise in a given area? Part of what you're probably going to hear my friend from Oregon, the lawyer, saying is, you know, when the Christian Reformed Church gathers its synod and we make decisions about science, we have no expertise. A whole group of mostly pastors should not be making decisions about science. Scientists should be talking about science. Now, you're going to hear the name of Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper, you can look him up on the internet. It's a very interesting figure. He was both a church reformer in the Netherlands, and you might have remember Roland and I mentioning Abraham Kuyper in our video. He's both a church reformer in the Netherlands that led a splint-off group that's important for Christian Reformed history, and he became the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. This guy was an amazing man, but he was active both in Netherlands politics and in the church. I mean, he wrote a lot of theology, and he was a secular politician. And he had a lot of ideas about this, and so a lot of those ideas are the context for the conversation of the Christian Reformed Church in this. And so in this video coming up, you're going to hear a lot about Kuyperians, and they're talking about Abraham Kuyper and his legacy. And he had this idea of what he called sphere sovereignty that said the church should make decisions with respect to its area of expertise. Politicians should make decisions with respect to their area of expertise. Scientists should make decisions with respect to their area of expertise. But as with anything in the Christian Reformed Church, you're going to find Kuyperians on both sides of the aisle, and they're going to be arguing about what Kuyper said and meant, usually because it aligns with whatever they think should be happening now. So Abraham Kuyper is a name that will come up in this. But you know, that idea, though, that, well, we should kind of segment society according to expertise, or in Jordan Peterson language, competence hierarchies. Society functions better. Let the church manage their stuff over here. Let society manage their stuff over here. Let science do their thing over here. That's, in a sense, is that classic liberalism? Maybe. The difficulty is that so many of our issues cannot really be contained to one thing. Look at the question. Should an unborn fetus be given the political standing of citizen and human being? Well, there's politics in there. There's religion in there. The definition of human and human rights is all founded in religion. And there's science in there. What about biology? And so a question like abortion cuts across all of those realms. This is all difficult. So should the church say anything about abortion? Yes or no? Should the church say anything about climate change? Yes or no? How does the church as institution keep its witness and priorities? What you'll find in some churches is that political issues have completely taken over the conversation of the church. Here's the reality about a conversation. Only one person can talk at a time, and we can only really listen to one person at a time. Conversations, like consciousness, are rather monofocal. And so if all Paul Vanderklay is talking about, let's say, issues on the left, race, sexuality, some of these things, well, then you're going to think that's all Paul Vanderklay is about. If all Paul Vanderklay is talking about is Jesus and the resurrection, that's what you're going to talk about. Now, here's the difficulty. politics and religion works at very different speeds. Religion is a very, 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 very long conversation. And it's keeping its eye on issues that transcend generation after generation. Politics is very local. It's very now. It's very geographical. If the church has to somehow navigate this very long conversation with these very now conversations. This, for example, the Christian Reformed Church in North America is just in the U.S. and Canada. You think about how the Roman Catholic Church has to manage this. Wow. You've got people from all over the world. And then, or even, let's say the Anglican Church. There are 5 times more Anglicans in Nigeria than there are in England. Now think about that. Think about how that impacts Anglican politics. And if you want to look at an area of church politics right now that is as hot as anything, look at the Episcopalians, Anglicans, and watch the fight that goes on there. Christian Reformed church politics is mild compared to church politics in the United Presbyterians and the Anglican Church, even in our sister church, the Reformed Church of America. Part of that is because the Christian Reformed Church, generally speaking, is pretty conservative. And this gets into such complicated business. Now, lest we camp on easy slogans or fast solutions, you can look at a couple of historical examples. The church in Nazi Germany. Germany, at the beginning of the 20th century, was in some ways the most powerful, the best educated, the most religious, the wealthiest nation in the world. England would be its rival. And you could make a case that England was more. But the triumph of the Nazi Party, the church had to figure out what to do with that, and churches went in different directions. And the conversations about that continue to this day. How did the Roman Catholic Church stand up to fascism? I'm going to let the Roman Catholics talk about that. I don't have a dog in this fight because my church comes from the church in the Netherlands who got the bad end of the stick. And so you talk to Christian Reformed Church people about Nazis, they'll say, I don't like Nazis. You know, they killed my grandfather. My grandfather fought in the resistance. So, you know, so the Nazi Party takes power. What does the church say? Some churches wanted to stay neutral. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you know, very famous Christian, collaborated in a plot to kill Hitler and died in prison in Nazi Germany, wrote some amazing books. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is in the conversation. The Barmen Declaration came out of the struggle with Nazism, and you can read about the Barmen Declaration. So what should a pastor, let's say you're a pastor in Germany in 1934 or 1935, before the beginning of the war, after Hitler takes power, he's very popular. Do you talk about Adolf Hitler or not? It's really hard to know if you should. And what are you going to say? Obviously, I'm sure there were pastors that lined up with Hitler. I'm sure there were pastors that refused to take a stand. And I'm sure there were pastors like Dietrich Bonhoeffer who denounced him and actively worked even to the point of violence to get rid of him. Well, here's history. Every decision you make has consequences. What are you going to do? How are you going to think it through? Well, this is part of the reason we're having the conversation, because here's a fact about human beings. We're smarter together than alone. Because if thinking is talking inside your own head, bigger thinking is talking with other heads who have different conversations in their own head. This is how we learn. This is how we grow. Hopefully, this is how we make better decisions. On the American context, wonderful book written by Mark Knoll, who's a member of the Christian Reformed Church. And he teaches at Notre Dame. He's a member of the Christian Reformed Church in South Bend, Indiana. Wrote a terrific book, gave some good lectures. The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. Really interesting book. Just recently, I saw yesterday on Christianity Today a review of a book coming out on what happened to those churches in the border states. A lot of Americans don't know American history very well. You had the Union states and you had the Confederate states, and there are these, well, you have the northern states and the Confederate states, and then these ring of states called the border states that had slavery but didn't leave the Union. And so one little tidbit, the Emancipation Proclamation frees all the slaves in the Confederate states but doesn't free the slaves in the border states. And that led to quite a bit of criticism of Lincoln when he made the Emancipation Proclamation, and slavery itself only gets outlawed by, amendments to the Constitution. But what happened to those churches in the border states? How did they stand? Did they continue to go along with slavery? And this was a big deal in terms of the Northern Baptist and the Southern Baptist. Now, when I say Southern Baptist, in our political context, most of you hear fundamentalist, evangelical, Republican voting, so on and so forth. Now, if you mention Russell Moore, this conversation gets more complicated, because Russell Moore, prominent Southern Baptist, was very much against Trump in the elections. So that's getting complicated. The Northern Baptist, well, what happened to the Northern Baptist? A lot of the Northern Baptist churches after the Civil War went liberal. They got swept up in the progressive movement and basically became part of the mainline movement. And whereas today, the Southern Baptist is a very large, robust Christian denomination in the United States, the Northern Baptists don't have anywhere near the numbers or the money or anything like that. Well, there you have it. Churches are part of the environment, and churches in some ways have to decide to go along with the flow, to try and step out of the flow, or to resist the flow. And, well, what do you do? And politics and the issues that get embedded in politics have everything to do about that. With all of the talking I've been doing about Jordan Peterson and the interest that I've raised about Jordan Peterson, I know that has hurt my reputation among some friends and colleagues in the Christian Reformed Church, because they're worried about me. How could Paul, son of Stan, become, someone who listens to this alt-right, blah, 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 blah. Okay, reputation, politics. This world was active in Jesus' day. It's active in our day. Each of us has to figure out what we're going to do in it. And there will be consequences, positive and negative, depending on what we do. Now, it's nice to imagine spiritually exempting yourself from all of this. And again, like the Essenes, that's one of the tacks they take. But these basic issues don't go away. And so, again, in the conversation I'm going to have this afternoon amongst those individuals, I'm going to probably start it in about an hour. I'll probably post these tonight and tomorrow. Should your pastor or your church or denomination tell you how to vote? So leave a comment in the comment section. Let me know if this was helpful for you at all.